Welcome back into the Poets Lighthouse. I am pleased to have with us tonight poet Sean Patrick Mulroy and his original poem, The Rough.
The Rough. Matt and I kiss for the first time in the Back Bay fens beneath a tree. It's night, and I've just asked if he knows what a shotgun is. He says no, so I take a long drag on the pipe packed full of dank weed, and I let the smoke curl past my lips like ivy down his throat. That's the shotgun, I say, pressing my forehead against his. He smiles. Steam escapes him in a sigh. His teeth catch the moonlight, then the blue wail of a siren as a cop car roars off Boylston and skids across the grass into the park. We split apart. Matt chucks the bowl. We try to walk away as casually as possible, but then the floodlight snaps on, blinding us. The officer says through his radio, "Please, this is my first date." People like to say the gay rights movement started with a riot. It did not. There were plenty of queers working peacefully towards the right to love each other openly, that is to say, authentically exist whilst unimprisoned and with any luck employed, since before the word homosexual had been invented. We like to remember Stonewall because it's the first time we took on the cops and won. A momentary triumph, sandwiched between years and years spent on our knees before the throbbing billy clubs of boys in blue. Even in the bars and neighborhoods we claimed as ours, we were too unruly to be left ignored, that is, unbeaten, until the plague came and the bruises surfaced from the inside. Then it seems we were a problem better left unmanaged, but alas, you've come for poetry and found instead a screed. I'll start over. Underneath the tree, I kiss a boy whose leather jacket is still warm from the inside of the apartment where we scored the weed that haunts the space between our teenage mouths. The year is 2001. Matt and I met on a dating website, one designed specifically for young gay boys looking to meet. I'm 17 and scared to meet a stranger, so I brought a chaperone. Her name is Laura, but she goes by Desdemona. She's the one who sold us the weed. When the police cruiser lurches through the darkness towards our bodies, Desdemona is the one who does the talking. When he asks us if we have drugs, she swears we were only smoking cigarettes. He says, "All right then, in the future, look at it from my perspective, guys. I see you in the park, behind a tree. What am I supposed to think?" After the cop leaves, we take a few minutes to find Maddie's piece, half buried in the mud. For the rest of the night, we debate whether or not the cop knew we were smoking weed. Because we are, all three of us, white, we do so from outside of prison. All systems are inherently fascist. Let me explain. In order for there to be organization, there must be a hierarchy. Such hierarchies are self-servingly constructed by the powerful and few. We like to think here in America we have bypassed this hierarchical problem through a meritocratic economic system and electoral democracy, but with all due respect, LOL. The marginalized, that is, the not straight, not white, not male, not cis, not wealthy, had no direct hand in the writing or construction of our republic. Since then, a lucky few have not so much been given power as they have been given access to power. Like all instances of the word access, a price is here implied. This is not a system which my people invented, but it is one in which we can thrive if we can afford to stay disciplined and inconspicuous, that is, silent and unseen. Matt and I met on a dating website. Every man I've dated ever has entered my life artificially. It's more common now for straight couples to meet through apps or online personals, but for the homosexual, this has been the norm for decades. The alternatives were dangerous. Public cruising spots, mostly, and these riddled with muggers, thieves, and last but certainly not least, police. The internet arrived and drained the back rooms and park benches of their pesky public sex. It organized the cruise park into an electronic system, replaced knowing glances, sweaty palms, and raw necessity with racy photographs of pornographic bodies. These bodies are most often able, cis, and white. They skew towards men with memberships to fancy gyms, access to trainers, healthy food, access, money, power, hierarchy. Most young faggots were born to a world of public emptinesses they don't know enough about to mourn. How could they know? The generation before mine and Matt's was more than decimated by disease. It was obliterated. Before we were old enough to claim a culture meant to be our birthright, it was bought out from beneath the piles of our dead. We grew up in a vacuum first, then a grid. Who would tell us of our wild history, our long-standing association with the civil rights movement, our roots in anti-capitalist activism? Billionaire straight men now own The Advocate. They own Out Magazine. They own Grindr. Oh man, this part of the park is safe, but see that tall grass over there? Matt points just across the river from our tree. Don't go there unless you're trying to get molested by a bunch of dirty old men. He laughs. I say, ew, gross. Desdemona packs the bowl. We all smoke weed. Matt and I kiss. When the cop car roars towards us, Des is hidden by a low-slung branch. The three of us then try to scatter casually, but freeze in the unthinkably bright spotlight of the cop car. Desdemona does the talking. Haloed by the law, she's striking, eyes blue as any siren. Seeing her, the officer's demeanor changes. He says, "All right then," and drives away. There's no way he could have missed the smell of reefer in the air, but that was never his concern. Matt and I, alone, behind a tree, a deep kiss, tall grass, close enough that I could hear it shuffle in the breeze. What was he supposed to think?
Goodness, that powerful story. So good evening. You're welcome, and thank you. Good evening, dear viewers, and thank you for tuning in to our original PGN show, The Poets Lighthouse. You are joining us today for the first episode of Season 2. Yes, we have made it to Season 2, and we appreciate you for coming along with us on this journey. I am, as always, your host, Finn Bell, a poet and writer from the San Francisco Bay Area. You just heard a powerful performance by our guest today, Sean Patrick Mulroy. Sean is a writer, actor, musician, visual artist, and faggotry hauntologist. He was born and raised in the American South, but has since lived all over the world and currently resides in New York City. Sean recently signed a book deal with Button Poetry after winning their chapbook contest. He will be releasing a full-length manuscript forthcoming in 2023. He has written, taught, and performed work worldwide, finishing a world tour right before COVID hit. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Sean.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So, starting with the first question.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. I wanted to go right into your poem, The Rough. You know, as I said a while ago, oh my gosh, like powerful piece. I read it over and over, and it seemed to reveal something more every time, which I feel was kind of like really your intention. So the poem opens up to a scene, a recollection of a first date. As the poem progresses, the landscape of the poem widens a bit, and we see everything along the edges. We see what is happening more clearly. In the poem, you say, "But alas, you've come for poetry and found instead a screed." Are we lulled that we are seeing truth finally, only to find it still presented through a warped lens?
I think with the poetry I'm working on right now, I think often I find myself so fueled by anger. One of the, I took a really long break from writing this past decade. I probably spent about half of it not doing a lot of writing. I did some touring, as you know, but or as you stated, but my ability to write was kind of hampered, I think, just because of how angry I was. So many things that are going on right now are so infuriating. And so often when I find myself writing, I feel like the sort of like craft equivalent of like, just like really scratching at a piece of paper with an angry pen, or throwing paint at the wall, and so when it comes to telling stories, which is usually how I make my political points, I think sometimes I forget how best to like access the sensibilities of a reader. But in this particular case, the sort of meta reference of it is supposed to be a joke. It's like, queer people are so often asked to perform in some capacity for other people's comfort. And so I think there's like a kind of there's a way in which that process being highlighted is in and of itself political, right? Like, yes. Yeah, I can give you like this exact same story with like a little bit more flowery imagery worked into it. I can give it to you with like a little bit more sort of self-consciously like poetic poeming. But generally speaking, a lot of this piece is just me telling a story as I realized it, many, many years later. Knowing what I know now about gay rights and about police, it really changed my perspective from the time. And I wanted to, a lot of this manuscript is kind of spent talking about the personal evolution that I think a lot of gay men go through, whereby they start out, I think, kind of thinking that if they are well-behaved and less sort of demonstrably queer in their presentation, that they will somehow be less stricken by society's expectations of homosexuals, and like they're not, you know what I mean? And I think a big part of growing up as a gay person, especially as a gay man, is kind of coming to the realization that you should just go ahead and do whatever you want, because the people who don't like you are never going to like you any differently because of how you act. You know what I'm saying? And so I think kind of coming around on that story in a kind of meta way, that turn, I think is deliberate for that reason. Like it does a thing where it's sort of, reenacting the experience of remembering things over and over again, and each time like a little different in tone, a little different in focus, and each time there's a new part of the story that comes to light that kind of changes your perspective of what's happening or what happened.
Yeah, it was almost as if seeing it told in a way from different people, different characters saying it each time, even though the narration was coming from one point of view. So that caused you each time around to focus a little bit more clearly on it and focus to see what was being said in between the lines. Thank you for that, Sean.
Thank you.
We are pausing for a brief break, but when we come back, more on our guest, Sean Patrick Mulroy. We return from our break with our guest, Sean Patrick Mulroy. We do hope that you're enjoying this episode so far. Sean, do you ever come across a poem of yours that you decide is not exactly for the performance stage, but instead you tack it down safely on the page for other purposes?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a couple of poems that I've written over the years that are sort of like visual pieces as well. There's a piece that's in the book that's forthcoming that's mostly like a series of different quotes kind of slapped together. And so when you're trying to create that live, you would need more than one voice, and it wouldn't be, I don't know. For me, the poems that don't live well on stage are multi-text and small scale, right? Because you don't want to recruit like 4 or 5 people to read 30 seconds worth of poetry. So I think that's where you often run into those sort of pieces that don't live well off the page. Generally speaking, though, as is the case for a lot of my contemporaries growing up, in the poetry scene in America, like I think we were really invested in creating work that lived beautifully on the page, that also was performable, that was, for lack of a less derogatory term, entertainment,
Mhm.
I take a lot of my sensibilities as a writer from the Romantics, and they were all of them social agitators, socialist agitators as well, and populists, and we were really, really invested in getting their work to a place where it could be understood, not just by poets, but also by. So yeah, I think that, like many of my contemporaries, I was super invested in work that lived both on the page and off the page. I take a lot of my sensibilities from the English Romantics,
Mhm.
who, for the record, take a lot of their sensibilities from the ecstatics of the Middle East, like what would now be Iran.
Yes.
But their politics, they were socialist agitators. They were really invested in poetic populism, which is to say that both Wordsworth and Coleridge, and then later the younger generations with Shelley and Byron, I think, kind of talked about how poetry that can only be read by other poets is like self-indulgent and useless. And in
Mm.
general, that's how I feel. I'm not here to impress my contemporaries. I'm here to emotionally, I don't know. I feel like in many ways it's like about being like an emotional midwife for like non-poets.
I
It's
see.
often very difficult when you don't live in a sort of self exploratory state most of the time, like poets often do, to really experience and understand your own feelings. And I
Mhm.
think that's sort of what our job is. Um, so most of the time when I write, it's very explicitly with the idea that it's going to be something that I read on a stage somewhere at some point. Um, but yeah, so the short answer to your question is yes, there are some
There are some.
that
Okay.
don't live off the page. Yeah.
And how do you feel that would come, like the one that you were talking about where it is basically quotes. If it was just only you doing it and embodying each of those voices for each of those quotes or each of those portions, would that hit really differently if it were to be a performance piece, or is it just absolutely a
So
no,
it's only
big
about a
no?
stanza long. The one I'm thinking
I
of is only
see.
about a
Okay.
stanza long. And what it is it's text from the back of a porno tape, like an old 1980s porno tape,
I
and
see.
then like dialogue from the same tape, and then the poem is kind of woven or cut into those texts as they're spliced together. And so it's not just that it's like different voices. I think that it's very deliberately disjointed. And so maybe if it were longer, an audio setting where you had more than one person reading, or I guess like if you had like tracks of me reading behind myself while I read live, you could do something with it.
Mhm.
Um, but I don't think it necessarily enhances it. It's more about, that's a piece that's more about establishing a specific kind of ambiance. It's something where I think I'm trying to kind of replicate the sort of disjointed and fervid nature of consuming pornography uh,
Mhm.
through poetry,
I see.
But yeah.
I see. And it's funny the era that you brought up, it made me think automatically of that tail end of that that high that the high point in the mid 70s towards the end of the 70s of the golden age of porn, and then it hitting that slump coming towards like the 80s. So I wonder if that there was any of that involvement of that as well. Um,
I mean, a lot of my politics and
uh-huh.
a lot of my work comes out of an era there, um, where I think gay people were having this really important sort of cultural zeitgeist moment.
Yeah.
You know, pre the AIDS epidemic, gay subculture was as vibrant and as differentiated from mainstream culture as, hip hop was, a couple of years ago, or,
Yes.
it was a subculture. It was a rebellious subculture, and I think pre-AIDS, it was so fashionable that you even see like straight people appropriating it. I
Hmm.
always point out that like the Village People, none of the Village People are gay,
Yeah.
and they're like a very famous like gay band. They did the YMCA song, right? But that was actually just straight people making money off of gay culture, because prior to the AIDS epidemic, it was so vibrant and so particular that it made up this very separate sort of like set of sensibilities and concerns. So I think I focus a lot of my politics there, because that's a place where I think we were very powerful as a group.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's one of those things where, yeah, I think there's a thing where almost all of my work in some way connects to that vibe, that
Mm-hmm.
sort of like gay separatist vibe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think every social movement has its separatist moments. I think the queer separatist movement was cut short. I think there's something to be said for looking at the ways that we are encouraged to forget our differences.
Yeah.
You know, I think there's this notion of like, oh, we're all the same, and it's like funny because we don't all have the same rights or experiences or like health risks or
Exactly.
you know, and so maybe in some golden future where all of those things disappear and everyone's fully equal, I'm 100% ready to be like, oh yeah, no, being gay is like, you know, a hairstyle or any other kind of sort of skin deep quality about a person. But until that day, which is I doubt going to be in my lifetime, that's for sure. You know, I think we have to kind of be mindful of our differences. And the last time culturally we were truly mindful of our differences, I think, in a way that felt triumphant, was pre-AIDS America for us. You know, certainly for gay men, that's the case.
Yes, yes, and that's you know, like very important. So I guess, you know, like having that sort of thing to be archived, you know, for the posterity is important, when that, even when that day comes where it becomes where people begin questioning it. Um,
Yeah.
so going through your bio, Sean, I was caught and reeled in by how you described yourself as a faggotry hauntologist. I'm always fascinated with the idea of events so concentrated that they linger in physical places and in objects or in people.
Yeah.
Does that apply here too? Did you coin this verbiage? Did you coin this verbiage? And would you
So yeah.
perhaps, yeah,
Oh,
no,
go ahead. Go ahead. No, please. Go ahead.
no, if you wish to talk to us a little bit more about that, it is a very juicy term. I want to explore more. I would like to explore more.
Sure. So hauntology is something that I believe, I want to say it was Michel Foucault came up with. It's a pun. It's a pun by a French philosopher on ontology, right? Ontology,
Mhm.
the same. Hauntology is this sort of nebulous concept that was explored further by an American media critic named Mark Fisher. It's essentially discussing lost futures. So what we're haunted by in the case of ontology is less about you know, past events as it is like what might have been. So for me, being a hauntologist, for, you know, faggotry, for lack of a better word, is I think about sort of exploring again the world outside of the realm of HIV and AIDS. You know,
Mhm.
so much of what we had culturally was lost so quickly. So much of the camaraderie that we had as a community was lost so quickly that I think a big part of my life is spent sort of imagining and exploring this version of the world that doesn't exist in an attempt to try to create a modern version of it, you know. But hauntology is not my particular term, and it's still one that's being defined in cultural criticism. But generally speaking, it's about sort of the study of what haunts us, what could have been, what
Mhm.
might have been. And there's so much of that specifically missed opportunity among my community and especially among my generation that I think it's worthy of study. And it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, which is why it ended up in my bio the way that it did. That makes sense.
It absolutely makes sense, and it just tickles the idea to further explore. I'd like to see how a path would have diverged if that had been a that lost you know era, lost past would have become something that came into reality had the epidemic not have happened, what would have flourished.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back into, I read another one of your poems that you had suggested. It was, and that you had suggested as a beginning piece for this segment. It was Gay for Pay.
Yeah.
In this poem is the lines, spoon-fed bold sweat by the camera, spoon-fed soft food by your mother. What are the thoughts that run through your mind right at this moment with these lines read back to you by me? And what did they call forth when you first wrote them?
So, I have a really morbid fascination with dead porn stars because I find that, I've always been super fascinated with pornography outside of the context of it being stimulating sexually. I think it's a really interesting piece of text. I think you learn a lot about what people are doing in the bedroom in a different era, depending on what kind of pornography they're watching.
Yes.
Gay culture in particular is super defined by its porn. Like you mentioned earlier, like this sort of golden age of pornography in the 70s and in the early 80s, which transitioned to this like very sterile, very artificial post HIV/AIDS pornography. Like in my personal opinion, pornography from like the late 80s to like early aughts is the worst porn because nobody has any body hair. Everybody's using like 4 condoms stacked on top of each other. It just feels like very sterile. So I'm always super interested in looking at which to be clear, I mean, reflects the state of the culture at that time, right? It was very sterile, it was very isolated, very protected, very insular, cellular, I should say. But with this particular line, I have 2 thoughts. Reading it back to me, it reminds me of my very good friend Emily Carroll, who is the managing editor of a magazine in the States called The Baffler. It's like a socialist agitation magazine. And they do a lot of cultural theory as well. And I remember I was reading that poem to her on the phone. I just started writing again during COVID, and she made this like noise, and she was like, "Oh yeah, no, that upset me." And I was like, "Oh good." So for me, I think what I was writing at the time was kind of this juxtaposition of like, here is a person who has been captured on camera at perhaps their most alive, or their most seemingly alive. Insofar as like it's a however artificial it might be, watching somebody in the act of like having sex is that, man, they're just going to interrupt every single one of my best sentences. Just give them 1 second, guys. I'm so sorry. I really intended to be in my soundproof office, and
they seem to want to.
Anyway, so the point is that I think when you watch somebody kind of in this sort of moment of having sex, that's a very animalistic part of human life. It's a lot about feeding and about subsistence and about sort of the greedy taking of the body's needs. And then to see that reduced to in the other kind of appetite with this person who has since been hurt and sort of damaged by assault, it's still love, it's still hunger, and it's still animalistic, but it's just so different. This is a person whose mouth was used to to stimulate a lot of people in different ways, and then sort of at the end of his life, it's just another place where life is barely taking place after this sort of tragedy that this person endured. Yeah.
Okay. I something that you said made me think of a tiny follow-up question, and then I think we're going to be hitting our end point.
Okay.
But I wanted to ask, because of this influx of people able to produce very safely and very effectively, their own from their mind's eye of what pornography, to different type of, to different sections of our society, do you think there's a little bit more truth that's coming out? Say, for example, if it's specifically to lesbian or pansexual, gay men, is that, when they're pointing it specifically at the group that they represent, is there more truth coming out now that's reflecting a mirror on that society?
It's interesting, right? Because I think, look, I think a lot of porn that's made by women or for women by women is very progressive. I think women in general have a much more nuanced and sort of esoteric approach to pornography as a medium, because I think, you're looking at a group of people for whom direct, just straight up, grab what you want desire is inherently discouraged from a very, very young age. We socialize women to not reach for what they want. Yeah. So I think they're light years ahead of the gay community. Gay pornography, we just came around on having non-white people in our porn. I'm kind of kidding, but only kind of, there was definitely a lot of these websites out there that were showing young, straight college men, and that's supposed to be the sell point. And then they're all the same white boy with the same muscles and the same personality. And it's not that they aren't each individually beautiful. It's just that without that variety, I think it becomes monotonous. What we see with this sort of proliferation of self-made or small studio porn, I think, is we see a lot of these taboos being attacked from different angles. So I've done a lot of study of porn outside of recreational use. I've done a lot of academic sort of work on it. And I think we can pretty solidly ascribe whatever the pornographic subject matter is to a taboo as simply violating the idea of it being one man and one woman loses its power as a taboo. We're seeing these sort of more specific niche taboos broken. You might see someone who's much older than their partner. You might see somebody who is willing to pay for sex in a way that's it's fake, but it makes for good TV. But as far as truth, certainly one thing that I really am looking forward to and seeing a lot more of in these sort of home filmed projects is I think there's a lot of really beautiful sort of variety of bodies, which is super important. We underestimate, I think, how important or how powerful it is to allow yourself to fantasize or to be appreciative of in some sexual fashion a body that maybe isn't like yours or is maybe different from what the average person reaches for sexually in their head during the fantasy. So I think sort of shuffling that up a little bit is allowing for more healthily what's the word I'm looking for? A more, I guess, a more holistic experience with your libido in context of media, for sure.
I get that. Yeah, absolutely.
But I think the reason why I write about pornography so much is because, like I said, I think there's something truly at once visceral, obviously, but then also very moving about pornography. Even fake pornography, very poorly made or very professional to the point of being sterile. It's still the recording of two really raw moments, in two different people's lives and two very human bodies. So when that later meets with death outside of the video, like it does in that poem "Gay for Pay," I think that juxtaposition is something that I find deeply fascinating. Maybe a little sublime.
Yeah, no, I can see that connection. We probably have to. I feel like we have to talk more about this, off camera one of these days.
For sure, yeah.
I thought I was alone in kind of contemplating it in that fashion too, in a fashion other than what the what's on the surface. So I'm going to end, Sean, Patrick, with the with this game sort of. It's I like to end a lot of my episodes with a word association. So I'm going to do.
Okay.
fun word association, poet edition, if you're a game. I'm
Okay,
going to
sure.
name a poet. I'm going to name one poet, and you will say the first word that comes to your mind when you hear that poet's name.
Sure.
Okay. Galway Canal.
Oh God. Seducer.
That wasn't entirely unexpected. It wasn't. Percy Bysshe Shelley.
Oh, he's my hero. I love Percy Bysshe Shelley.
Okay, give me a
Yeah.
little bit give me the word, and then give me a little bit of a blurb why you chose that word.
I think just like vanguard, you know, when I look at Shelley's sort of body of work, and also Shelley's sort of like biography, he lived a pretty impressive and exciting life. You know, he traveled a lot. He met a lot of amazing people. He was one of the boldest feminists in like the history of the canon for a long time. He really helped get his wife published, whom he cared about very deeply. And so like we can kind of thank him, however indirectly, for facilitating the advent of modern horror, which I think Frankenstein really is. But he also is somebody who had a really good understanding of how history works. You know, if you read some of his more like common poetry, you look at something like as simple as Ozymandias. I think I always was impressed by how much he had his eyes on history and how aware he was of his relatively minor part within it, and how he still tried really hard to push the envelope, to push the political moment forward. Yeah, he's definitely a personal hero of mine. I love his work too.
Well, a great big thank you to you, Sean, and always a thank you to our audience for continuing to tune in to the Poets Lighthouse. Please go to thevanishingman.com to learn more about Sean Patrick and his work. You can also follow him on Instagram at The Vanishing Man. Please show your love to the Poetry Global Network by tuning in to our other original programs on YouTube and subscribing to our channel. We hope you have a great weekend ahead.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.